There we go. And so, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Eye of the Archives. I'm Joan Ilacqua. I'm Executive Director of the History Project, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight for our conversation with author Isaac Fellman. Before I introduce Isaac, I wanted to introduce you all to the History Project. I know some of you are kind of frequent flyers, part of our History Project community, but for those of you who don't know, we're Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We're a volunteer-driven organization with the mission to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history and stories of Boston, Massachusetts, and New England. And so if you'd like to learn more about our work or check out digital collections, feel free to check us out at historyproject.org. You can link out to our social media from there as well. We have some more virtual events in the works for April and May, although I only have one that I'm ready to announce so far. We will be having our second book club event on May 26th. So please feel free to join us for an informal discussion about Franny, Queen of Provincetown by John Preston. I'll put a link in the chat later on if you want to head over there and sign up. And I just want to say, as always, thank you so much for your support of our work. If you'd like to support our free public programming and our work to document and preserve LGBTQ history, please consider making a donation or setting up a recurring donation on our website. And I'll send you a link for that as well. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Isaac Fellman. Isaac is the Lambda Literary Award-winning author of the recently published book, Dead Collections. His next book, The Two Doctors Gorski, is coming this fall. And his first book, The Breath of the Sun, came out in 2018. Isaac's an archivist at a queer historical society in San Francisco. I'll let you give me permission. Isaac works at GLBT, Historical Society in San Francisco. And yeah, we're so pleased to have you here tonight, all the way back in Massachusetts. I have some questions for Isaac. We'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we're happy to open the floor up to questions from the audience. And like I said, feel free while we're chatting to put them in the chat, and we'll do some Zoom hand raising later on. And yeah, so yeah, Isaac, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. Ooh, okay.
Yeah, I spotlighted you. I also spotlighted me, which feels a little
okay. This is much less terrifying than beaming into a mirror.
Yeah, it's Zoom. We've been Zooming for over 2 years now, and I feel like
and we still haven't arrived anywhere.
Exactly. Sorry. That's exactly it. So yeah, so Isaac, you and I know each other from running around in queer archivist circles, and parasocially on Twitter.
Yeah.
And your book, Dead Collections, the main character Saul or Soul?
I said it's Soul until like interviewers literally started saying it's Saul, and I was like, yeah, it stands for Solomon. You're right, I'm wrong. So yeah, Saul.
So I did the same thing in my head as I started reading it, and then at some point throughout the book, I realized that it was short for Solomon. So Saul is an archivist at a California Historical Society, and I'm curious, your day job is that you are an archivist. What was it like to write about archives? What drove you to this setting and this scene?
You know, it's I had been writing a bunch of really research heavy stuff, and I have started writing really research heavy stuff after this. And I just you get to a point in writing about people who are totally unlike yourself, which is where every writer's comfort zone. I mean, I don't want to say every writer, but most fiction writers that I know sort of write in order to have an out-of-body experience without using drugs, which we're scared of. There's so many sweeping generalizations about writers in that 30-second spot. But anyway, I had been writing for a long time in a very disembodied way, and in a way that didn't have much to do with me. And sort of concurrently with my decision to transition, which is to say, living in my human body, I thought just for novelty's sake, I would write something that like still wasn't autobiographical, but described experiences that I had had and emotions that I had felt. There was no extrapolation. It would be close and immediate. And so, from here, I thought about, basically, I thought about complicated experiences that I have had with donors and with archival material that, without spoiling that there are ghosts in the book as well as vampires. I was thinking a lot about the hauntedness of archives, which is, not the first person to say that, but certainly the first person to write a novel called Dead Collections about it.
And I think there's a line at some point at the very beginning, or the first probably third of the book, where Saul is kind of musing on what it is to be dead in the archives. And Saul is not to spoil anyone who hasn't read it yet, Saul is a vampire who
First
works in
page spoiler.
archives.
Yeah.
So, Saul's literally dead in the archives. You mentioned at some point, sometimes there are dead things like, I think you mentioned bones in the archives and other pieces of people.
A lot of
I was
hair.
thinking, back on my own archives experience, that there are a lot of things that are not just paper in the archives that sort of tell the story of the people who are there. I do wonder, were you inspired directly by your work at GLBT in coming up with this?
Yeah, it's I didn't want to write a roman clef because I think that I don't know, that's just nerve-wracking in ways that are not productive for me to attempt to write about. If you only know, the secret, you would be able to recognize my coworkers and my job exactly. It is not a flattering portrayal of this society, so it would be very self-destructive of me to actually air whatever personal and professional dirty laundry I have. But it's definitely based on some observations about working in archives and working in nonprofits. The fact that it's such an anxiety-making fishbowl to work at this fictitious historical society. It's a very small group of people. They're all very dedicated to what they do, and they have very different ideas about how to do it right. It's just the thing about working for a small company or a small nonprofit, admittedly like my job, is that there's no privacy, there's no anonymity. You're not part of a composite of like 100 faces. You are one of a group of 8 faces in a Zoom chat. So that's sort of like awkward intimacy with both your coworkers and with the collections, because it's you're in a department of 1 or 2 people. That definitely was the part of my experience that went into the book.
Yeah, and I think that the one thing I thought about was, I really hope that these other characters are not based on coworkers, because it would be very easy to map.
No, all my coworkers immediately read it, and they I did sort of steal a lot of our physical space for the description of the archives in there. It's on the same corner. The taco place across the street is the same. And so one by one, my coworkers were like, "Oh my God, you said we had mice, but not rats. We have mice, but not rats. It's just like us." And I was like, I am going to just go under my desk like there's an earthquake and not come out until you leave. But yeah, no, it's that part's very real. Definitely mice.
Well, mice are depending on what your collections are, mice are easier to deal with than rats or other archival pests. I think something else that struck me about the ways in which you write about archives and nonprofit work is the level of dedication that people have to the type of work that they're doing. Archivists are usually overworked and underpaid. And I should preface by saying I'm not complaining, but I think we all kind of say that. But there's also, I think, a really strong dedication to an importance of the type of work where you are responsible for these things that people have left behind. You're responsible for their lives in a way, and you can see how deeply Saul feels that in the work that he's doing, and how things turn out later on in the book with collections. There's a lot of, I felt like there was a lot of grief actually in this book, both in terms of real archival grief, the grief of giving something away, the grief of donating something that a loved one had created before they died, but also the Saul's grief of having to deal with change And I think my question with that is really, did this book happen pre-pandemic, or were you working on this when we were all dealing with that big worldwide change?
Right on the line. Like March 2020 was about halfway between the two ends of the book, maybe a little bit later. I try not to read my Amazon or Goodreads reviews because that is, not good for me and not good for the people who write Goodreads reviews. But when the book had just come out and I was like just jonesing for feedback of any kind, I read a couple, and most people like really liked it. And a few people like had the really specific critique. About halfway through, there's a change in this book. I don't know, like the momentum of it is just different. And I was like, oh, different people have different responses to that. Some don't think so, some do, some don't care. But I feel like you can definitely see the point where I stop being excited to live in San Francisco and start missing living in San Francisco because I lived in Oakland at the time. So I never, a lot of the stuff that is just sort of like most obsessively attached to the city of San Francisco, like at some point, like the characters break into this particular mall called the Metreon in order to hide from the sun. And like just all of that stuff was just me desperately wishing that I were back in the neighborhood of my work again. There you get that, like, like when Yves Lenoir is talking about how Brideshead Revisited embarrasses him now because like it is written from a place of wartime deprivation, and it shows like his obsession with fine and beautiful things that he could not have. That's a nonsense critique. Evelyn was not, the best judge of his own work, but I think about that line a lot. Writers writing from like just sheer lack and absence of what they really need. So.
Yeah, I think that I sort of felt halfway through is when things pick up in terms of big changes happening too. You really feel that Saul is in a holding period for at the beginning of the book. Saul is in the middle of transition forever. Saul is living but not really living as a vampire. Saul is living in his office and surrounded by archives 24/7. Saul is being bullied at work by an older butch lesbian coworker, who's the only other gay person in the office that I had personal lesbian feelings about, but we can get to her.
Yeah.
And so, but you see this switch flip, and this other character, the love interest Elsie, who is living outside of the city, comes into the city and changes everything. And so that is, I apologize to everyone in the audience. I don't have a concise thing to say about that, but it is funny that you see that happening at the same time as you're having that kind of, it's sort of like last semester of college feelings about San Francisco almost. Like, we're going to leave here, it's going to be different, and let's start the love letter to it now while we're still there. We can talk about Florence. So Florence is the lesbian character who works as the assistant archivist, who I think acts as though she is the archivist in Saul's workplace. And I will say on a personal note, she is kind of a bully, trans exclusionary radical feminist who, on the one hand, I was like, this is great, there's this lesbian character. And on the other hand, I was like, oh, she did exactly what I didn't want her to do. Can I ask, like, who is she based on?
She's really one of the characters in that book who like is based on a human being the least. I said that nobody in this book was based on one of my coworkers, and that is true, but like sort of inevitably, like Elsie is a couple of different people that I have known. Like the DNA is in there. A little bit of me is in Saul, obviously. I can't pretend that that's not true. Like Tracy is just the character who is Saul's love interest in the book, Elsie. has come to the archives to donate like their late wife's materials, and their wife's was like the showrunner of this TV show from the 90s that they both used to be obsessed with. And this woman was Tracy. And like, she is just sort of like a worst of all possible worlds version of like a cartoonist that I used to work with and really know and admire. I'm just like, God, what if that person, but completely the opposite of everything that that she tries to be, and yet somehow with some amount of essence. Florence came from absolutely nowhere, and in fact was the character who developed the latest. And she was young until a very late draft of the book, and I realized she needed to be older than Saul because her difficulties with him have so much to do with having had sort of an earlier vintage version of a very different butch journey than he did. She just really feels that, like, having come to butchness, in her 40s, after a long period of trying to do compulsory femme heterosexuality, it came at such an enormous cost for her. And I think that it's been really painful. It screwed her up. I hope she's in therapy. I don't mean that in a snarky way. Like, I literally feel I want this character to learn to be better to herself and others. But yeah, and she looks at Saul, who is like, a guy who to her seems to have had an easier journey and sort of copped out by being a guy. She's fascinated by him. She's viscerally upset by him. She kind of likes him, like, in a weird way. They kind of like each other. They're very much work frenemies, but she also, wants to not see him again. And, I'm going on about Florence for a little while, but I really do want to say, I don't want to spend all of my time writing about lesbians who are horrible. My first book has some lesbians who are good. It's just that, like, in terms of two queer people who are sort of who just are warped mirrors of each other. I feel like an old school butch who's, a woman and pretty comfortable being a woman, and like a trans guy who was never comfortable being a woman and didn't want to be one and never saw being a butch lesbian as a real option for him. Those are people who have like a lot of productive conflict and a lot of reasons to make each other nervous and sad. And boy, there's nothing like having a coworker with whom you have that kind of relationship. You are stuck together. It is no exit. So, yeah.
That's a really great way of putting it, though, as productive conflict, because there's, as we've seen play out in real life and many other venues, that sort of conflict going completely off the rails into gender critical feminists and other.
Yeah, you can really spiral out of you can spiral into a very different reality from that which trans people inhabit. And I was sort of trying not to make Florence somebody who has gotten all the way there, because I want to like my characters and understand their reality is basically kind of similar to mine. But yeah, no, I don't know. It's definitely just a really sticky and thorny character to spend time with. Yeah, but sometimes they just show up and announce themselves. I don't mean to be a mystic, but writing is weird that way. Sometimes people are just like, hi, Isaac, guess what I am? Guess who I am? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging me that question, because to pull the curtain back a little bit, I sent Isaac some questions in advance, and my question about Florence was, let's talk about Florence. I am so mad but not surprised by Florence, and then I never followed up with a question about it.
It's fine. That's how I feel about her too. It's fine.
So, but speaking of writing, I think another theme in this book, I do have some questions about some more archives questions, and I think that's kind of our audience here tonight, are sort of archives history folks. But there's this big fandom plays a huge role in this book, in a way that I, as a millennial who grew up with the kind of option to go to the internet and to create or to read about gay characters who were not portrayed as gay on TV, really connected to. And so, as you mentioned earlier, Saul's love interests, deceased wife was a showrunner for a show that you describe as a knockoff of the X-Files in space. And it turns out that Saul and Elsie were both part of the fandom around this. And for those of you who may not be in this part of the internet, fandom is essentially the sort of culture of fans around different pop culture things. So like Star Trek famously has a huge fandom of people who write slash fan fiction where Spock and Kirk get together. And there are so many other iterations of this. There's an entire website called Archive of Our Own that has millions of stories that people have written. Not all of them are gay, but a lot of them are. And yeah, I think this is the first time I've seen fan fiction tied up with sort of exploration and discussion of gender and sexual identity all at the same time. And that made me want to ask you, were you part of a fandom?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, I did a lot of fandom stuff from when I was in my teens until I was in my early 30s. And I started doing it again recently. It's like I sort of disappeared from that scene for a while just because of interpersonal stuff. Fandom can also be a lot because, sort of like work, it's a large group of people who have an intense relationship with what they're doing and different ideas about how to do it right. Same thing. And sometimes that can just really give rise to a lot of conflict, a lot of intensity. Like in my case, a pattern of intense friendships that sort of turned sour. I super hugely. And like I am now in like an active like weird fandom inception. Like I am writing an original historical fiction novel based on the same historical events as the thing that my current fandom show is based on, because like every act of writing begins with like a decision to completely do something self-destructive that in which you just own yourself completely. I don't know, like I don't know how to write a book that does not in some way begin with like a patently bad idea. Like I'm going to try to tell this story that I'm obsessed with in a different way that's my own. It's what really gets my blood up. I'm like, yeah, I will rise to that challenge. I will do that in an original way. Nobody's going to stop me. I won't stop me. This is a long ramble, but yeah, no, definitely super about fandom. And also to a large extent, this book is about younger trans people, especially back in the day, because, these characters are my age, they're 40-ish. They remember the 90s really well. They were in fandom in the 90s. And that specifically was a time when a lot of trans folks were using fandom to like really try on the idea of transition, especially a lot of transmasculine fans, I should say, but also like avoid transition. You can imagine yourself into the mind of a guy so completely that, like, number one, it's very affirming. And number two, it's not something you have to think about outside of the computer. So like, and that's just me. It's just literally me. So yeah.
Well, it's also, I will say to my own experience, I know that before I realized even what I was doing was looking up stories about different, I was a huge nerd I don't know if anyone's surprised. I was a big nerd as a kid, and watched a lot of Japanese anime VHS, and then would go on the internet and try to find stories that people had written about these characters. And at the time I was like, oh, I'm a straight 14-year-old reading fan fiction about these guys and women sometimes, and all of these other, and you can make it whatever you want it to be, and didn't realize that was my way of trying to find a queer community that wasn't as scary as saying like, here I am and I'm part of you and this is what I'm doing. It's sort of looking back on it. But it is this opportunity, I think, to try things out, but also, you know, during a time where I think in the book, Ellen's not out yet. You know, we're not talking about gay people on television at all, really, for people to, you know, make their own stories, make them find themselves elsewhere. And I do wonder if that will change the way that people interact with fandom in the future now that representation is different than at least it was even 10 years ago. But we don't have to answer that question. I think we'll see how it plays out.
I've got many thoughts, but yeah, it's I don't even have like formed thoughts. I know that our flag means death is going to change a lot of things, but also like that because it's a show that's sort of designed as fandom bait, like super clearly, but it's also explicitly queer. And while this is not the first time that this has happened, like usually TV has more of a complicated like teasing, here's some food, for the people who, like are starving for queer representation, but we're not going to go ahead and make them kiss. We're starting to see like people who are making TV where the characters the fans want to kiss actually kiss, and exploring the complications of that relationship. I don't know what's going to come out of that, but like I think that it is yeah, it's a very interesting moment to be paying attention to fandom and fan studies. Yeah, much happening.
And for those of you who haven't binged it yet, Our Flag Means Death is an HBO show. Have I already mentioned this in this conversation? We may have already talked about it.
It's just everyone's just thinking about Our Flag Means Death right now.
Yeah, it's so the two main characters are based on two historical pirates, and there's a lot of tension between these two characters. And if you're someone like me, you read it at first as like, ooh, there's some tension there. They're never going to go there. And then they eventually go there. So
yeah, no, they totally do.
Oh, there we go. Micah says in the chat that I mentioned it at the web archiving committee immediately preceding this event. So anyway,
sorry to spoil it, by the way, they do kiss. Also, it has a really weak first 3 episodes, and I'm sorry about that. It gets really good. I can't believe I'm saying it gets good. But it does. Nah.
Yeah, it's great. And so we sort of just segue from pirates back to vampires. I think, if you read the blurb about Dead Collections, it says, Saul is an archivist, Saul is a vampire. I think there's a cultural assumption that means that Saul is going to be like, the Dresden Files or the Magicians or some other kind of like urban paranormal character who's, in the archives, but is also a detective of some kind. And the way that you really talk about vampirism is really, it's normal. It's almost like a chronic condition. And I kind of wondered, how did you get there? How did you decide to treat, to create a vampire character in this way?
Yeah, it's like so I am very fascinated. Like, as you were saying that, I was like, oh God, this is the part where I'm going to crawl out of everybody's screens and start like giving my sort of like usual rant. It's not even like a rant. It's not a complaint. It's just a fascination that that people see archives as a mystical career. And like most representation of archives in fiction is about magic archives or like spooky archives or horror archives. I am not bucking this trend. I like guilty as charged because among other things, archives can be all of these things in a lot of ways. They induce a lot of altered states from working with them, from just the sheer strange emotions that they elicit and the awareness of history and death that they bring on. But yeah, I think also I am a contrarian, and it's literally just that. Like, I want to do a different thing from other people. With vampires, you can't do a different thing from other people because somebody has done every kind of vampire. But I at least was sort of not particularly drawn to highly romantic vampires. I definitely wanted to write about sort of like the prosaic experience of being a vampire, where like it is mostly sort of seen as a medical condition. It's kind of stigmatized. People, they get weird about you in sort of the same way that people sometimes get weird about trans people, where they see you as very sexy and yet also very repellent, unless they've examined themselves, or unless they're just not inclined to think that way. But a lot of folks sort of like load us up with a combination of trans people are very desirable and also trans people are very disturbing. And so I wanted to sneak a little bit of that in. But honestly, like I just have a lot of friends who do disability studies. I have listened to them a lot. And while being very wary of representing a disabled experience in terms of monstrosity, which can be very sketch, I think that I sort of wanted to flip it around and describe monstrosity in terms of a disabled experience. And in the process sort of drain it of monstrosity and make it just sort of expose it as something that because like disability studies 101, the first thing that you will hear at every panel is disability is socially constructed, which I think is a thing that is worthy of challenging in itself and complicating, but pretty much true. And Saul's problems would not be as great if he lived in a world that had infrastructure that let him escape from the sun, which can kill him, or that would allow him to work, in a way that he doesn't have to secretly crash in his office to be safe from the dangers of the outdoors. This guy would be doing better if people sort of recognize that he's not a radically different kind of person from them, and he's not to blame for the ways that he's suffering. But people insist upon punishing him, I think. And also, like, even if we are disabled due to something that is our own fault, we still deserve accommodation and care and love. Like, I don't mean to also draw a distinction between, like if Saul chose to become a vampire, then he wouldn't deserve help. No, he would deserve it either way. As it happens, it wasn't his idea. So thinking about vampires a lot, kind of for the first time in my life. Glad that people liked my vampires, because they are not based on like a deep knowledge of the genre, and I did worry about that.
So I think there's also, we did an event last October where actually a National Park Service ranger came in and talked about queerness and Dracula. And I think that it's one of those, there are deep connections between, I think, queer and trans characters and vampirism kind of across. I'm sort of putting on I'm pretending to be an English lit major hat here, but depictions of Anne Rice's vampires and others in the last 20 or 30 years that I think that tracks. What I thought you did very differently than that, though, is that it doesn't romanticize all of these, like all of Anne Rice's vampire characters are like divinely suffering in some way, or like, very they most of them remind me of paintings of Saint Sebastian. It's Saint Sebastian, right? The one who is like
getting shot a bunch of times and
with
in a
arrows,
gay way,
but is like exactly divinely kind of suffering. And Saul's just suffering and apologizing for it a lot. I felt like I felt bad for Saul. I really, and it does turn it on its head from, archives are a mystical place where magic happens to. No, this is his job, and it's not great all the time. So but I'm keeping an eye on time because I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. And I have sort of a wrap-up question for you. And so I'm going to ask it, and I want folks to start thinking about, if they have questions for Isaac, and feel free to put them in the chat and I'll read them out loud. But yeah, what's next? What are you working on right now?
I am writing, I've got a manuscript that I'm shopping right now, which is kind of like a multi-generational trans family saga about revolution. And yes, I hope that sucker sells because I'm really proud of it. And I am writing a non like I am writing like a historical, I was going to say a straight historical fiction novel is what I'm trying to say, but it's not straight because I am the writer that I am. About yeah, I should, I've been going back and forth on like, because people keep asking me about fandom and I'm like, do I talk about what my current fandom is? But like in a few years when this book is hopefully published, I'll probably be talking about it because it's the backstory. So like I got obsessed with 19th century polar exploration because of the TV show The Terror. And so like this is, it's a gay novel about what all of my shit is about, which is like a person feeling bad about a document. But in this case, it's a polar explorer feeling bad about another polar explorer's documents relating to like mid 19th century polar disasters, and sort of like the invisible thread of queer history making and like queer recognition in history at a couple of different time periods before queerness was codified or just as it was being codified. So I'm in over my head with that last part. Like I'm totally happy with like writing about these like sad guys walking across endless seas of ice. But in terms of thinking about how people thought about queerness in the 1840s versus the 1890s, I know a lot, but it's so weird to because also you want to I'm going to stop talking so that we can take questions, but you want to challenge the idea that that queerness was not invented before Oscar Wilde, which I think talking about how it wasn't codified can like lead us to, I think, the fallacy that like no queer person understood themselves as a distinct kind of person. And we know from like the journals of Anne Lister from like 100 years before Wilde that like there were totally queer people and sort of always have been who are like, yeah, I'm a kind of person. In the case of Anne Lister, like an awesome kind of person because nobody had like, Anne had no problems ego-wise. God bless. I love Anne too. It's something we have in common. Anywho, that's what I'm working on. That's what's next.
Well, now I have to go watch The Terror.
It's great. It's great from the beginning. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, that's great. So I'm gonna unspotlight us so that we can see folks.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hello again.
In a gallery. But also, so please feel free, use the hand raise button, or if you're on camera and you want to wave, feel free, and I can make sure that we get you unmuted. Yeah, I think I'm sort of thinking about the line of queer history and defining queerness before what is gay before gay, which comes up, I think. Actually, I think more often now that comes up as an argument for there were gay people before the word homosexual was created, which we know is not true. Why would they create, why would they create the word if there was no one to describe? But it's something that I think historians sometimes try to really toe the line of what you can call queer before a certain point in history.
Trans, yeah.
In trans especially, and yeah, and especially as we're heading into that season where I know I personally do a lot of pride conversations with straight audiences and having to explain I like the word queer because I am a 33-year-old and it's the year 2022 and this is some of the language we use now, with the understanding that I'm not trying to point throughout history and say this person was definitely some label that's a modern term. But it complicates things. Are there any historical examples you're using other than Anne Lister?
Damn, I feel like I have thoughts, but like they're flying out of my brain. No, it's like also like some of the because like part of what was going on is I started doing all this historical research about the people The Terror is about, and finding all this stuff that just seemed really gay. Like in ways the show is not unhomoerotic. Like it was definitely an adaptation by queer people, or at least one queer person, the showrunner, based on a heavily homophobic original text, which is complicated. But yeah, I was thinking a lot, and I started delving into, also just what the historians who are working on a lot of these guys, who often are involved in fandom, are like finding out. And I guess what I'm saying is that, like one of the main characters on the show, which is not based very heavily on history, which has allowed me to make more room for it. Right, it's allowed there to be more room for me because I can take the history in a very different direction, except still a queer direction. This historian I know, like, found, he had this guy who he was best friends with. They were explorers together, and they traveled together for 30 years, and they lived together. And this guy who was his friend was married to a woman, and but like we have letters where like they were referring to this woman's sisters as their sisters-in-law, like almost like there was a poly thing going on. So it's like, I guess what I'm saying is I'm thinking about Lister, and I'm thinking about sort of what I know about like the era of Wilde, and sort of like what was changing in terms of like recognition that, and like codification of queerness as just a kind of person, which I really do believe that a lot changed a lot around those trials. Like, that's a conventional historical truism, but I think it's also true. Yeah, I'm also just looking at my little dudes, and thinking about the stuff that they wrote down, and thinking about the stuff that they crossed out, and like the parts of their letters that are under pools of ink. And I'm thinking about those stray references to our sisters-in-law. And I'm thinking about what it means to like sleep next to a guy in the magnetic observatory you built together in Australia. I'm thinking about a lot of stuff. Yeah, and there's also stuff that I will remember after this, because I actually do know something about queer history, I promise.
I mean, you know a couple of things. There's
a few things. Yeah.
And again, if folks have questions for Isaac, please feel free to hit the hand raise button or wave at me on camera.
I promise to stop talking so we can actually ask questions, so I can talk some more.
I mean, I'm enjoying your answers, so I think that,
good.
Speaking on behalf of the audience. Oh, Jessica, go right ahead.
I have a question.
Hi.
First, I very much enjoyed the book. And I guess the question is a little bit of a speculative question, which is, at one point in the book, and there is basically, there's kind of an understanding of the ways in which the existence of the internet and the potential kind of expansive digital archives can change our own relationships with our own pasts, through basically one of the characters or a couple of the characters digging up things. They're like, oh yeah, well, it's there. It's still on the internet, or it's still in my email archives. I know this is a question that's really of interest in queer and trans archiving right now, is like, how do we capture that? Does that change our relationships to our own past to have that stuff out there, not necessarily under our own control? And sometimes, even though it seems like it's going to be there forever, it's actually not. It's going to disappear. So that's a very inchoate question, but the digital past.
Yeah, the digital past is a whole, especially like it's a whole thing. I was going to say, I suppose it's also like a hole in which memories disappear, but yeah, I was definitely thinking about that a bunch, because I was looking at there's like an online archive of old like posts from Usenet and like really early like forums and listservs. And I was looking at that and just sort of thinking about how none of those people consented to have their materials archived and made public in this way. And it's wonderful to see, but it's also messed up. And I selfishly, I don't want it to go away, this like sort of extensive digital archive, like the Wayback Machine. But there's also something to be said for the more time I spend in archives, the more I think about consent specifically as an archival issue. And we think about it in terms of the donor's consent, which of course we always get. We ask them to donate their copyrights as well. They can agree in a really granular way to the terms, will there be restrictions? But the people who are in this, like, God, just the other day I had this, my colleague found these really torrid letters with selfies from a person who was an ex of the donor. And I was emailing them like, how would do you want me to send these back? Because, and I guess I have, this is not a very coherent answer. It's just that like, these characters, they get a lot out of finding their past online. And they're also horrified by what they find because, they learn that they didn't necessarily like each other and didn't behave well towards each other. And their full legal names were on these posts because we were very naive on the internet at that time. Yeah, it's, is it really necessary? I just, how do we reconcile the archival impulse with privacy and safety? Yeah, and where do we draw the line? How old does something have to be before we stop thinking about privacy and safety? I don't know. Oh, well, that's my answer. Sorry.
We were literally talking about this in the web archiving committee before this meeting. So it is something that I think we're all thinking, at least those of us who work on the acquisition side of archives are thinking about,
Yeah.
Whose permission do we have to have these things? Are stories and letters that were for personal consumption, but have made a huge societal impact, do those belong to society? And some days I'm like, of course they do, because there's not that much queer stuff that we can find to point to. And other days I'm like, oh God, if somebody saw the sorts of things that I write to my wife, I would be horrified. Even if they were, life-shaking documents of a time period. It's hard. It's really hard.
Definitely a lot of stuff I have written that would cause me to like physically turn into a poisonous gas rather than a human man. Yeah.
Oh, Rory, go right ahead.
Hello. I also really love this book. I read it in a blur this week to come and be part of this talk. I have sort of a formatting, like a story question, because the book begins with Soul saying he's remembering these events, and throughout the whole story we get glimpses into like the future that Soul is remembering from the like letters to his past self, and we get these little glimpses of the happier outcome that he gets to live, and all these asides about him living with his partner, which were a bit of a balm in some of the more painful and emotionally dark moments. And I was just wondering like how you sort of came to find that kind of story timeline formatting, and if this novel is already like sort of always meant to be a character reminiscing about a time that seems to be sort of as major a turning point in his life as transition or vampirism, finding his partner and sort of having everything up a big upheaval of sorts, if that was always sort of meant to be a looking back.
Yeah, it definitely was. I write a lot of stuff where characters are literally writing in the first person. It is most of the manuscripts that I have published or am writing or am trying to publish. And I didn't especially like it for this particular character at this time, partly just because I was sort of tired of doing it for a book and wanted to take a break. But also, I don't know, I'm realizing like as we speak that the reason is it's for archival reasons. It's because this is the version of his past that he has put together. out of the experience and memories. And here is what he has decided that it means after sort of looking at the personal archive of his memory. His interpretation of it is going to change, as he tells the story to himself again and again. It's going to get more revisionist. I don't think it's, I don't know. I don't like treating people's identity as spoilers. So I will also just sort of say that, like, as you know, Soul's partner, Elsie, also like decides to transition to some extent, is still figuring out what it's going to look like at the end of the book. And I think also, like, as their journey goes on, he's going to stop thinking of them in the past as a woman, which, they've sort of given an explicit permission to do, and just sort of start using the pronouns that they're currently using. Yeah, it's just sort of meant to be a little slice of perception as he sees it from a few years later, but not many years later. So yeah, that's what's in my mind. Thank you for asking. That was a good question.
So we still have a couple minutes left. I just put all of the links that I promised that I would share with you all in the chat. Does anyone have another question for Isaac? And again, I'm happy to read them out loud if folks don't want to unmute themselves.
If you have like an esprit d'escalier moment after this and realize what you would have asked, just my DMs are open. Come say hi.
If no one has a question, I could ask another question, but I do want to leave space for other people.
I think go for it. We're giving folks a lot
just
of.
go for it. We've got another couple minutes.
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So this one is a fandom. We'll say slash novel writing question, which is.
I ship them. I ship fandom and novel writing.
Yeah.
I want them to get together and fall in love.
The answer is probably no. But did you ever consider then writing a novel that is the Feet of Clay, so that it is the TV show that is in the book, that's the past TV show from the 90s? I'm just thinking about a number of pieces that I know that have kind of gone in that direction, both related to fandom, but also I researched romance writers, and there's a few small things where people have a fiction character who has a show or a story they're writing, and then they actually write that story.
The Rainbow Rowell strategy.
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah.
The Feet of Clay universe is just taken from a manuscript that I wrote several years ago that I was never able to clean up to my satisfaction. Like most of the sections from it that are excerpted in the book are just taken from there. I just like, I did some auto cannibalism, because if you can't cannibalize yourself, who can you cannibalize with that? It's kind of an interesting world, but like I preferred to approach it through glimpses rather than write at full length about it. Like, among other things, there's a ton of trans stuff in it that I needed to get older to like think about. I needed to actually come out as a trans person to think about. So yeah, it exists, but it's not good.
So I kind of wanted to ask a final question sort of about your work in queer archives. Could you tell us how you ended up in the archives?
Geez. When I was in grad school for my, what was supposed to be my English PhD, I got really obsessed with, I was at the University of Oregon. I got really obsessed with this correspondence that I was researching with Joanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr., who were two queer genre authors from, the 70s and 80s. Russ's career was longer. She was younger than Tiptree. And Tiptree being somebody who was like assigned female at birth and pretty much lived as a woman, but had a professional identity that was male, and was later outed and had a very difficult time with it because the identity was very, very important to Tiptree, whose pronouns I am determinedly avoiding because I think that probably they were pretty complicated. I was just overwhelmed with the fact that they let me look at this stuff and touch it with my hands. Just seemed wrong. It's like, oh, it's so important. It's so intimate. It's so beautiful. These people are having this insane correspondence where they're fighting and falling in love and yelling at each other about what feminism is. And then I thought, oh, I could never be an archivist, though. I'm sure it's for like people much smarter than me. And so like I went off and did other stuff for 7 years. Then I was like, I should at least give this a try. So, did a bunch of weird jobs. I worked at the Charles Schulz Museum with Charlie Brown and Snoopy. I worked at a hospital. I worked at another historical society. Then this job opened up and I got it. And it's cool. It's a very cool job. I like archives.
Mm-hmm. And we had talked about like I say this in meetings, there are certain objects that I want in the History Project's archives that GLBT has that we don't have, including, if anyone's listening, a glory hole.
Yeah, we got one.
Yeah, they have one. We don't, where's Boston's? But I think that it's just funny when Isaac and I get on conversations, even when we were preparing for this. What were we talking about? We were talking about hair and jars.
Yeah, we've got these jars of shaven pubic hair.
Wild things in archives.
Kink is very archival in that it tends to have more physical accoutrement and like objects. I really appreciate it as an archival, experience for that reason. But yeah, no, that's what this guy was into. He shaved his boyfriend's pubic hair and put it in jars and labeled it carefully with their names. And now we have them. I was going to make a very stupid joke about Boston glory holes having to be placed harder because there's sometimes deep snow. But just sorry.
It's the wrong time of year for that, but I'm sure that would be really accommodating during January and February. Jessica says that was very Ann Lister of him.
It really, I think Anne would appreciate that a lot, actually. Yeah, she loved hair. Whenever she got a haircut, she wrote about it in her diary. Like, even if it was just a normal haircut, it was like, yeah, I got that done. I think it was I think Anne was pretty butch, and I think it was just kind of affirming to her particular gender situation. Even though it was still long, it was shorter long.
Excellent. Well, it is now 8:00 here on the West Coast, or East Coast, here on the West Coast. So it's 5, I believe. And so I'm going to let people go. I just want to say again, thank you so much, Isaac, for being here with us tonight, for answering our questions, and for your work on this book. I'm really looking forward to the next one and the others that you're shopping around.
Again, thank you so much.
Oh yeah, no, my pleasure. And folks are saying in the chat, thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight with us. Again, if you're interested in the History Project, I put some links in the chat about where you can find us, how you can support us, and a link for our upcoming book club where we will be reading Fanny, the Queen of Provincetown by John Preston and having an informal discussion at the end of May. So, all right.
All righty. I'll see you all around.
Yeah, have a great night, everyone.